Hello, and welcome to Travels Through Time, the podcast made in partnership with Colourgraph. Hello, I'm Violet Moller. In this episode, we will be visiting one of the most magnificent periods in our cultural history, the Italian Renaissance. Our expert guide, Mary Hollingsworth, is going to take us into the dark and brutal world of politics and war that dominated this period. In her sumptuous new book, Princes of the Renaissance, Mary opens the door to this paradoxical world where princes spent as much time making war as they did making merry, and conspicuous consumption reached new heights. She draws us into the tangled web of dynasties who ruled the Italian city-states in this period, constantly vying with one another for political power and cultural prestige. The complex interrelationships between these great ruling families shaped the political history of the peninsula, and their patronage fueled one of the greatest flowerings of culture the world has ever seen, as artists and craftsmen were put to work painting, sculpting, designing and building the wonders that still draw visitors to Italy in their millions today. An expert on Renaissance art and culture, Mary Hollingsworth is the author of The Medici, which won the Telegraph Book of the Year award. She has also written specialist art history books, including Conclave 1559, The Borgias, The Cardinal's Hat, and Patronage in 16th century Italy. I spoke to Mary the other day. Mary, welcome to Travels Through Time. Thank you very much for coming on.
Well, thank you for asking me.
We're going to talk today about your absolutely sumptuous book, Princes of the Renaissance, which is just such a treat because it is bursting with the most beautiful colour images, which are all integrated, and it's quite an unusual, it's a treat, a rare treat to have so many wonderful pictures.
All in colour. I can't claim any credit at all for that. It's the publishers, and it is the most stunning looking book. I completely agree.
It really is, and the design of it's so beautiful, and I love at the back there's all sorts of family trees and tables and maps and extra information, which is very, very useful because the stories of these princes are quite complex, and their families, there's so much intermarriage that was going on. And so before we start and we actually go back to the year that you've chosen, I was hoping that you could explain to us a bit about the structure of the book, how you chose these different moments and stories to tell.
It's a series of essays dealing with usually more than one character in of an important prince of the Renaissance. So because there are only room for 12 chapters, whereas there are an awful lot more princes, and they're all quite closely connected. And so I've chosen quite deliberately sort of things that compare and contrast type characters. So the first chapter is about two men, completely different backgrounds, who brutally, violently came to power, one in Milan and one in Naples in the beginning of the 15th century. And then there are other chapters that deal with brothers and sisters, that deal with the husband and wife. And there are political rivals rather than, by the 16th century, there tend to be less war and more jaw, if you like. But there's sort of issues of status and that kind of thing is one particular chapter, and how you set up a dynasty, particularly if you've got a pope in your family, is another chapter. And so I've chosen representative people, which gives some idea not just of the historical facts that events that occurred during the period, but also that give you some sense of the real people involved, and the relationships between them. As I say, like kings and like husbands and wives and brothers and sisters and in-laws. And in fact, all the princes were quite closely related, and their hold on power radically altered in the late 1520s. So just when Charles V He was King of Spain, ruler of the Netherlands, and emperor, also banished colonies in the Americas. I mean, he was an immensely powerful man, and he effectively conquered Italy slightly less directly than I'm making it sound. But that's the background to the year I've chosen. But it's also the nub, if you like, of the book, because practically all the princes' lives were totally disrupted by these wars, and particularly by the emperor himself.
And can you just tell us a bit about how Italy was structured? Because obviously Italy didn't exist as a united entity in those days.
Italy was divided up into a lot of small, tiny little states. Some of them great big states, like the Kingdom of Naples, which stretched from just south of Rome right down to the heel and the toe of Italy. So it was a very big land, but not very fertile, so not very wealthy. Whereas Milan, which is a duchy in the north, was quite large, but on the very fertile Po Valley and Po Plain, and also on the trade routes to Northern Europe. So Milan was a much more smaller, but much wealthier state. Then there were tiny little states like Mantua, which is really very small indeed, and Urbino's very small, and Ferrara's quite small. Then there were these were all princely states, and there was also basically Florence and Venice were both republics, slightly different in their political makeup. And Venice, by and large, historically had kept out of Italian politics in establishing trade links between Constantinople and Northern Europe, sort of bringing the link. So that was trading priorities were totally economic.
Yeah, they were good at kind of keeping out of things, weren't they? And
yeah,
steering their own course.
Yeah, and also, physically, for anyone who's been to Venice, it is physically off.
Yeah.
Off the mainland.
Yeah.
And in the old days, there wasn't a causeway. You had to go across by boat.
And that stood them in good stead, several times when invading armies arrived and they just sort of couldn't get across the water to attack the city.
Exactly. But it was a fear. There were occasions when they were literally sort of the Imperial army was eyeing them across the lagoon.
Yeah.
And luckily it didn't. But I mean, if you'd had the sort of, it would be possible. It wasn't impossible to invade Venice, but it wasn't. Well, it was I would have thought a bit of a daunting task.
Yeah. And then, of course, there were the papal states, which were sort of another.
The papal states are quite complicated because they are a series of quite often very small states. Rimini is a papal state. Ferrara, oddly, is a papal state, but that's in a slightly different context. And Urbino is a papal state, and they're the sort of the towns and cities, Rimini, all those states along the sort of east coast of Italy, the Adriatic coast. And historically, they were given, in inverted commas, apparently a gift from the emperor to the pope. It just happens isn't true, but this is what they believed. And they owed their loyalty exclusively to the pope, and the pope could kick them out at will, and did. Urbino, one particular instance, the Pope wanted Urbino for his nephew, and so he just told the proper Duke of Urbino, to get packing and go, and that was it. He had to leave.
And that was a crucial part of all the sort of constantly changing balances of power that was going on in this period, wasn't it? That you'd get a Pope who was a Medici, and suddenly he would be rewarding all his relatives with the best fiefs.
And when one pope died, another pope would be elected with a whole completely different sort of set of political priorities, and a completely different family would sort of come to dominate. And not enough emphasis is put on how radically papal policy changed with the election of a new pope. Whereas, by and large, the princes tended, that their sort of policy changing was dictated slightly more by events, but it was a much more smooth process.
So it's fascinating. So you've got these layers of the princes, and then the papacy, and then, of course, on top of that, the Holy Roman Empire and the Imperial power on top, all
swirling around, and the King of France.
Of course, yeah. And then
minor detail.
And then the Turks as well, who everyone was basically fighting.
At this stage, the Turks are coming up through the Balkans and approaching the southern borders of the Empire of Hungary. So, I mean, it's in flux. Everything's in flux. The one pole around which everything was swinging really was the emperor, because he was so powerful. And it's interesting that when he died, he didn't leave the whole lot to his his son inherited Spain, but he left the empire. He encouraged his brother to become emperor.
Yes.
I mean, so, although they were related, it was just
it was too much. It was too, yes, exactly. And I think that was one of the things that really comes across in your book, which is, you know, you're very interested in patronage and the arts, and there is this sort of tension between the constant wars and battles and the brutality of the lives of many of these princes and their subjects, but then that contrasts with the beauty and the luxury of their lives when they weren't on the battlefield. And I just think that's such an interesting feature.
It's really fascinating that but they knew how to enjoy themselves, that's for certain.
They did. And I'm sure we'll talk a bit more about that later. But the other thing that struck me very much, which I think is important to point out, especially with relation to Charles V, is that these courts were peripatetic. So they were moving around almost constantly, visiting one another. And then I love the idea of everybody setting off to Venice to go shopping, which seemed to happen on quite a regular basis. So can you just talk a bit more about that?
They had this fair on Ascension Day, and it was a huge event. You know, all the Venetians had to close their shops. I mean, and they had to open booths on, they were sort of, people were selling very specific types of things, so luxury goods, and on sale to, you know, to these tourists who all flocked in vast quantities. I mean, not just merchants, but quite ordinary people, as well as princes and their wives and mothers-in-laws, and you know, they made a huge party of it. You know, luckily for some, you know, we've got quite a lot of letters and things, so we know what they did. You know, they would sort of arrive and they would parade about and talk to their friends and go, yeah, buy things.
Amazing.
Particularly materials and sort of things like feathers and sort of
luxury goods from the East, and
luxury things from these, not necessarily very valuable stones, but sort of glossy stuff that made you look good.
Yeah. Wonderful. Okay, well, I think now that we've set the scene so beautifully, let's go to your year. So if you could travel back, Mary, to a year in history, which year would it be?
I think I would go back to 1530 in Italy. It's a big year in Italian history, and it's a watershed moment. The late, sort of from 1527 to 1530, a lot of things in Italy changed. And this is the sort of the beginning of the new era, where Italy is very unquestionably dominated by Charles V.
Okay, so before we go to your first scene, can you just set that up for us a bit? So Charles V arrives the year before, doesn't he?
He arrives in Italy in Genoa. He sails into Genoa in August 1529. That's his first visit to Italy. And bearing in mind that his army had sacked Rome 2 years before, and his armies had also conquered Milan and Naples by this stage. You know, he was basically Mr. Big. I mean, he was in charge of. He was the most powerful figure in European politics at the time, partly because his rivalry with Francis I. Francis did have Naples and Milan, but then lost them to Charles V's armies. Don't forget, Charles V also had not only his Spanish soldiers, but also the Imperial armies to fight for him, whereas the French only had the French.
So the French and the Imperial battle is sort of, the battlefield is Italy at the moment, basically. In some way.
In 1530, they are at peace-ish, you'll see.
Okay, well, should we go to your first scene? Can you tell us where we are, what's happening?
It's February the 24th, and you're in Bologna, which is a papal city in the north, just north of Florence, in between Florence and Milan, I suppose you would say. And we're here because this is the point at which Clement VII, the Pope, crowns Charles V Holy Roman Emperor. And this is a tradition that goes back, the Pope crowning a Holy Roman Emperor, which is why it's called the Holy Roman Emperor, goes back to Charlemagne, who was the first coronation was in 800 AD in St. Peter's. And this is the last coronation that ever takes place. The popes don't crown the Holy Roman Emperors after this. So, in one sense, historical sense, it's the last of an important and long tradition.
And why is it happening in Bologna rather than Rome?
Good point. Well, technically, But it happens, according to the letters and the diplomatic kind of arguments, it's a political excuse because he's arrived at Genoa, which is also in northern Italy. He's arrived with a lot of soldiers, and he needs to get his soldiers and everybody up into the empire to help his brother, who is the Archduke of Austria, to stop the invading Turkish armies who are approaching Hungary.
Right, okay.
And so we're told in the diplomatic correspondence, but as it happens, you'll find out it clearly not absolutely true. And there's probably one reason he was almost certainly extremely reluctant to go to Rome so soon after the sack of Rome, which had devastated, literally wrecked the city in 1527, so 2 years before. And so I don't think that is one of the principal reasons why he didn't want to go to Rome.
And is that because he didn't want to face up to what he'd been responsible for, do you think? Or
I think what he didn't want was, he was quite a modest person, and I think what he really didn't, he didn't like what had happened. And would you want to sort of go through the city, be slightly nervous of what the mob might do to you?
That's true.
And also, given that it was meant to be a celebration, the coronation was meant, would involve a lot of ceremonial, outdoor ceremonial. You wouldn't really want the option for people to take pot shots at you.
No, that's true. So describe to us, can you describe the coronation? What would it look like? I presume it was in a church.
It took place in the church, not in the cathedral in Bologna, but in San Petronio, which is the largest church in Bologna. And it was transformed with sort of screens and things into 2 or 3 chapels of St. Peter's. This is not the present St. Peter's. This is the old Constantinian basilica.
Right.
Much, much older than San Petronio, which is a Gothic church. So it was quite weird. They didn't literally hang draperies all over it, but they put all the symbolic items into the chapel where the coronation was to take place was a replica in wood of the chapel in the Constantinian basilica. And there was also a copy of the porphyry disc, which was placed on the ground in exactly the same place where the slab was in St. Peter's, where Charlemagne knelt to be crowned. So it was quite, it was meant to be St. Peter's. There was a sort of sense that you were in the right place, kind of thing.
And presumably the artists and craftsmen that you talk so eloquently about in your book were sort of drafted in and told, please can you design this so that it...
the Bolognese must have been going, rubbing their hands with joy when they heard that what was going to happen. But they think this was one of the very first occasions when everybody saw Charles V for the first time. And one of the people there said, rather surprisingly, he wrote this letter, he's not tall, but short like me and stoops a little. And he's got a long, small face and his mouth is always open.
Well, he had the famous Habsburg chin, didn't he?
He had the famous lantern jaw. But then at the end of the letter, he says, but he is well-formed, graceful and good-mannered. He was not a big jovial emperor, he didn't sort of look the part at all.
No. And so while the coronation happens, but they're there for several months, all of them together, all the great and the good.
They arrive in sort of October of 1529 and they leave at the end of March. And one of the things that there has to be done is an awful lot of political negotiation between Charles V and Clement VII. And that was quite interesting because the 2 men were put up in the town hall, which is quite close to San Petronio. But they were given adjoining apartments with adjoining bedrooms with a linking door.
Yeah, I love that in your book, sort of sneaking in and having chats about...
Getting out of each other's bedrooms. But also the other thing, the unbelievable idea of, Bologna's got 50,000 people. It was quite large, but not a big town in those days, city in those days. But, on top of that, you had the entire papal court and all the Spanish imperial court.
Well, I wanted to ask you about that. How did they fit in? Did they have, for sort of servants, did they have fields of tents and that kind of thing? It was winter as well, and Bologna gets quite cold in the winter, doesn't it? How did they manage? Did they build any new buildings?
No, they put people up in palaces. And certainly Isabella d'Este rented a palace. A lot of people would rented out houses. They moved out of their rooms and, shared with 3 households or something, would all go and live together and share the rent of the other 2.
Yeah, and also in those days, the idea of having your own bedroom and your own, that just didn't sort of exist, did it? People lived in a much more communal life.
And the important point is nearly everybody had somebody else, sleeping in their room. I mean, it was normal for a king or prince of whatever to have, valet or somebody sleeping in the room. Obviously, not all the time.
Yes.
But, for sort of, it would be the normal thing to do, would be to have an extra person, at least one, in your bedroom, because, you could be murdered. I mean,
Yeah, I imagine it was a bit like the Edinburgh Festival. So when, in the summer, when the population doubles or something for 1 month.
Exactly, would have doubled. Bologna's would have doubled.
Yeah.
But it was the social event of the century. I mean, absolutely. And of course, the other thing is that, which we forget, is that everybody travelled with their valets, their stewards, their equerries, and even their cooks and their carvers. And there were sort of competitive dinner parties, apart from the balls and the banquets and tournaments. And they went hunting in the foothills of the Apennines. But they also had these, incredibly competitive dinner parties. Who could have the grandest or the most intellectual, not only the cream of the aristocracy was there, but also the intellectual cream of Europe was also present, because they're employed as secretaries, humanists were employed as secretaries and things like that. But anyway, the people who really made money out of it were the second-hand dealers of Bologna.
Well, I was going to say, the grocers of Bologna must have also made quite a lot of money.
And renting out second-hand, renting out chairs and sort of tables and silver to sort of, just for the dinner parties.
Fantastic. Okay, so let's go to your second scene now, which is just up the road in Mantua.
Some sort of 80 miles away. And on the 2nd of April in Mantua, Federigo Gonzaga, who is the prince at this stage, he has invited Charles V to come and stay with him. And this is the first reason why there is the concept of him having to get to the empire to help out his brother quickly takes a slightly thinner line, because he spends 4 weeks in Mantua of heavy and, games and play. And one of the most extraordinary things about it is a slight sideline, is that this is the point at which Titian's career suddenly goes from being pretty good to stellar, because Titian meets the emperor in Bologna, and the emperor isn't terribly impressed with him and offers him a ducat, which frankly is an insult, and a ducat to paint his portrait, and Titian is rather insulted. But Federigo Gonzaga, who is a friend and patron of Titian, convinces Titian that he don't give up. And so when the emperor comes to Mantua, Federigo Gonzaga shows Charles V the portraits that Titian has painted of him, the Duke Gonzaga. And Titian is so impressed that from then on he is the Habsburg court painter. Only other person really that he paints for after 1530 is the Venetian government. Practically everything else is for the emperor or the emperor's family. Art is a very important point about Federico Gonzaga. He's got to be one of the most impressive patrons of the arts in 16th century Italy, and Charles V, for various reasons, rewards Federico Gonzaga, so he is now Duke of Mantua, whereas at the end of March he was still Marquis of Mantua. So he's just been made a Duke, and he puts on 4 weeks of heavy entertainment, which culminates in a sort of big party on the 2nd of April, which starts as a sort of lunch party. And then they play tennis for 4 hours, real tennis. Then there's dancing. Then there's a 3-hour long.
And just tell us about the room that they're in, because
the room that they're in is staggering. And this is the thing. The setting is the Palazzo Ta, which is one of the top Renaissance, magical Renaissance buildings ever. But it's built by Federico Gonzaga, commissioned his architect Giulio Romano to convert his father's stable block into a suburban villa. And Giulio Romano is very clever, and he understands exactly how to do things, how to make something look good but not cost very much. And particularly he would built in brick, which is quick, and it was covered with stucco so that it looked like stone. And he had an astonishing talent as a painter decorator. I mean, his frescoes just unbelievably awesome, but fresco of course is also quick and cheap. So there was a whole very big entrance hall which is decorated with life-size portraits of Federico Gonzaga's horses. These are racehorses that have won races. But the banquet takes place in the banqueting hall, which is decorated with scenes of Cupid, the marriage of Cupid and the Psyche. And it showcases the very ribald sense of humour that was shared both by Federigo Gonzaga and Giulio Romano. And it's completely covered with very drunk men and women in various states of undress. You're surrounded by satyrs and goats and things like this, enjoying the sensual pleasures of life, quite explicitly in certain occasions. It's a setting for a very, very decadent dinner party. It's perfect.
How do you think, because there seems to be this other tension between, as you've described, these incredibly erotic pagan depictions of people lounging around feeding each other grapes with not very many clothes on. How did they kind of fit that in with the Christianity, which was very much the structure of their lives, and I think that's a sort of, there's a tension there. I wonder if you could talk a bit more about that.
I think that one of the tensions that exists between Protestantism and Catholicism. I mean, there is a sense that one of the things that, for example, it's worth bearing in mind is that this in the banquet, the 2nd of April, but also the whole 4 weeks, or most of the 4 weeks, Charles is being entertained in Mantua. It's during Lent, and normally you'd expect people to be eating only fish, not meat. But the menus, we don't have detailed menus, but we do have sort of, the point is there was meat and fish on the menus. I would say that they haven't, that sybaritic pleasures were St. Augustine who says, make me good, but not yet.
Well, and I suppose if the Pope was, also enjoying himself and having lots of mistresses and banquets, then maybe there was less sort of pressure.
For certain. And by the way, the one point, the Pope didn't come for this. Didn't join them at Mantua. But it is worth bearing in mind, he did have an illegitimate son, but he pretended that it wasn't his. I mean, there were a lot of popes who had a lot of family, illegitimate children,
and presumably
whatever.
they thought they could live their lives however they wanted, and then as long as they built enough churches and endowed enough chapels and paid for indulgences to be said for their souls, then they'd be okay.
Hello, it's Artemis. At Travels Through Time, we're incredibly proud to be partnering with Jordan Lloyd and Colourgraph. Jordan is one of the world's leading visual historians. Through his excellent craftsmanship, he brings black and white photographs of the past to life in startling colour and clarity. Jordan's extraordinary work, as well as that of his contemporaries, can be found on the website colourgraph.co. At colourgraph.co, you'll be able to explore the process and history behind the colorization work, but most excitingly of all, you can also buy some of these beautiful photographs as museum-grade fine art prints. They make an unusual and striking present for that friend or family member of yours who loves the past, and they're an excellent addition to any room. Whether it's a colorized photograph of the US Capitol building from 1846, or a candid shot of the Beatles from 1964, you're pretty sure to find something that enchants you. I know I certainly have many times. It's hard to explain really over audio just how cool these prints are, so I encourage you to have a look for yourself at colourgraph.co. What's more, Travels Through Time listeners get 10% off when they enter the code TTT at the checkout.
Okay, well, I think now we should sadly leave the sumptuous banquet and move on to our third scene, which is not going to be quite as much fun or as decadent, I don't think.
Well, no, I mean, this is the thing that in the context of these last, the massive sort of parties in Bologna, and then this huge entertainment, 4 weeks of hunting and sort of basically eating and drinking. 60 miles, so similar distance south of Bologna as Mantua is from the north, is Florence. And in Florence, at the on the 15th of April, which is Good Friday, is the day I've chosen, over 200 people were dying each day from starvation, and the city was under siege by the Imperial army, Charles V's army. Now, the whole deal was Charles V wanted to be crowned. Clement VII was prepared to crown him, but hoped and what extracted from him promised that in exchange that the emperor's army could be used to force the Republic to to collapse, as it were, in Florence, so that the illegitimate son, Clement VII's illegitimate son, Alessandro, would be made duke. And the Florentines had learned about this the year before, when the Pope and the Emperor agreed to the betrothal of their illegitimate children. So the Pope's illegitimate son was betrothed to the Emperor's illegitimate daughter.
Yeah, okay, so just a bit of background there, though. So Florence had been ruled by the Medici family.
No.
Not at all.
They certainly were in a very powerful position, but they didn't rule it. And Florence was a republic, and it had a republican constitution. And within the context of the republican constitution, the Medici did achieve more power than they should have done. But they were then exiled because they were kicked out for precisely that reason in 1494. Yeah. And then they came back when Clement VII's cousin, Leo X, was elected Pope in 1513. So they were figureheads of a republic. It's worth bearing in mind, Florence is still a republic. And in 1527, they exiled the Medici again in the aftermath of the sack of Rome. Okay. The Imperial army had sacked Rome. The Republicans in Florence went, great, let's just get rid of the bloody Medici again. They sent them packing. So this is a kind of, it really matters, the Florentines. It really matters.
And that's very much connected to the humanist, the revival of classical ideas, and the idea of a republic rather than a monarchy or an oligarchy. Is that correct?
Well, it's true, but they are both tradition. They're both part of the ancient Roman tradition. If you think about it, Imperial Rome is also part of the ancient Roman tradition. It is an important point that the Republican Florence wasn't remotely interested in reviving the imperial tradition of Rome. In fact, that was consciously something they did not want to do. But they definitely, the Florentine humanists, looked towards ancient Roman Republic, pre-imperial, so pre-Caesar. For their inspiration, for their ideas. So, their heroes are people like Cicero, whereas, for the princes of the Renaissance, their heroes were people like Julius Caesar and Augustus.
Yeah, of course. Okay, so Florence is in this terrible state that the whole city is surrounded by imperial armies.
On the 15th of April, which is Good Friday, the army commander, he slaughtered an ass for the army to eat on Easter Day.
Yeah.
There's obviously going to be no lamb. The food was still getting in very, very small quantities via the little town of Empoli, which is in between Florence and Pisa. Pisa was still loyal to the Republic. Like I say, through Empoli, that certain convoys of food were getting in. But on the 15th, on the Good Friday, a convoy of cattle was seized on the road, and the 20 herdsmen with the cattle were all just butchered. Anybody leaving the city was liable to be shot on sight or arrested and hung. Anyway, that same day, the government, the Republic, had to put fixed prices on food. But what they really did, that must have been absolutely horrendous for the people, was compulsorily purchase, or seize, I think we call it, all stocks of grain that anybody had in their larder. And they also ordered everybody to announce what they report exactly what they had.
And was that so that they could share it all out equally?
Well, it was so that they could give the quality food, all going to the soldiers.
Okay, yeah.
But rather wonderfully, one of the things we have Michelangelo's larder list, for the 15th of April, and he had 2 barrels of beans, half a barrel of vinegar, and 8 barrels of wine. That's all he had. He had no meat.
Wow.
Grain. No cheese, nothing else. Nothing, no greenery of any sort.
Yeah.
It was just, and the Florentines, the really awful thing is that the Florentines, they knew that they were going to be in for a bad time, because they knew that an alliance between the Emperor and the Pope was always going to be bad for them.
Yeah.
I think they hoped that they would be able to solve the problem by diplomatic means, and normally that kind of thing would happen. But Clement VII, who himself was a Florentine, you've got to remember, and a Medici, obviously, he refused point blank. He even refused to let, the emperor tried to persuade him, alternative ways of dealing with the issue. But, the only thing that Clement was prepared, absolutely adamantly, the only thing he would accept was the Medici in control of Florence and the Republic dead.
Yeah.
It's awful.
It does seem extraordinary to be so obsessed with your own family's power.
Exactly. It's sort of brutality of it is
Yeah.
staggering. But anyway, eventually they had all sorts of wonderful ideas about how, I mean, that's the thing that was really, one of the things that did amaze me was the ways that the Florentines, once they realised they weren't going to get out of it by diplomatic means, they started thinking of all sorts of other things. And one of them, the government one day debated the idea of sending plague-infected material into the Imperial camp.
Well, that had been done before, hadn't it? There's various moments in history when diseased bodies were sort of catapulted over the walls.
But it's such a stupid thing to do if you think about it, because I mean, you can't. If the plague infects the camp, what's it going to do to who are all around you? Then obviously, and that's exactly what happened. First, the Imperial camp got the plague, and then it came into Florence.
Yeah. But it dragged on, didn't it, till August, the siege?
Yeah, it dragged on till August. And at one point, by the end of July, 300 people are dying every day, and several of those from the plague. And they issued orders. The government issued, according to the Venetian ambassador, by the way, stayed in Florence throughout the siege, which I think is quite, I mean, because he could have left.
Yeah. Why do you think he stayed?
Well, I think because he felt loyalty towards them. I mean, he reported that just before the city fell, that the government had issued orders that the guards at the gate, the Florentine guards at the gate, all the soldiers, were to kill all the women and children in the city and burn the physical city, and all the men were to go out and fight to the death. This is the quote: so that with the destruction of the city, there will not remain anything but the memory of the greatness of the soul of its people, and they shall be an immortal example for those who desire to live in freedom. That's the Venetian ambassador's word. So I think,
wow,
that's why I think he stayed. I think he saw the point.
Well, and also he was from another republic, so he was, doubtless a Republican himself. But that's very lucky they didn't burn the whole city. That would have been a huge loss for all of us.
It would have been a huge loss.
Wow. Yeah. And how, so, Rome was sacked in 1527, as you talked about earlier. I wonder how quickly cities were able to then sort of pick themselves up after a traumatic event like that and then, kind of get back to normal. Did that happen quite quickly or?
No, I think Rome was back. Charles V came back to Italy in 1536 under a different pope. It's now Paul III and Farnese Pope, and was given a big reception in the city and taken on a sort of tour of the ruins of ancient Rome.
And did he put any money did he invest in?
By that stage, the massive amount of money was spent doing up the city for that event.
Right. And that was provided by Charles?
Yeah. No. That was papal coffers. But Paul was a much cannier. He had a cannier business team behind him, I think.
Yeah. Fascinating. Would have been a really incredible period to live through, I think, for many, many reasons. And I have got my one question that I have to ask you. I'd like to ask you one more question before we finish. And that is, if you could pick one of the courts that you talk about in your book to visit, which one would it be?
Well, the awful thing is, I mean, I know the temptation, I know what I want to say, but the tragedy of saying, encouraging people to go to Mantua is, the city is very small. It would be very sad if it became a huge tourist centre. But
I don't think there's not much danger of that happening at the moment. Anyway,
but it is the most. I mean, quite apart from what Federigo Gonzaga did, with the Palazzo Ta and things like that. There's also the Ducal Palace, where his father and grandfather. It's stunning. It is stunning. In the 17th century, the Gonzagas died out, and a lot of the collection, their collection of Titians and various other painters, were all moved and bought by other people, which is why we in England have the Queen owns the part of the royal collection are Mantegna's Triumphs of Caesar, which was made for Federico Gonzaga's father.
Yeah. Yes. Wasn't there an exhibition quite recently of them? Or am I imagining that?
Yes. But Mantua is quite special. It's small and it's very sort of, you can sort of see how it, you can see everything happening.
Yes. Yeah. I know what you mean. It hasn't changed too much. I love those cities, like Toledo in Spain. You can actually feel like you are in the medieval times when you're there. You can feel like you're back in time.
Not like Florence, which is, has lost its centre, has completely been destroyed. So you can get a sense of Florence, but not
same way. No. Okay, so the final question is, of course, if you could have picked something up from one of these three scenes and smuggled it back to the present with you, what would it be?
I think it would be a piece of plaster off one of the houses in Florence, which were daubed with the sign "Poor but Free."
Oh, I like it.
That sums it up. Their defence and their stalwart defence.
And their passion for the Republic. Wonderful. It's been really interesting talking to you, Mary. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you so much for coming on. That was me, Violet Moller, speaking to Mary Hollingsworth last week. Her book, Princes of the Renaissance, is out now, and it is a real treat. It's absolutely full of the most beautiful colour pictures. It really is a sumptuous celebration of the Renaissance. Thanks so much for listening. Until next time, goodbye.